In the year 1353, a young scribe named Thomas sat in a monastery scriptorium, his hand trembling as he wrote the words that would haunt him forever. The world that was is gone. We who remain must build something new from the ashes, though we know not how. The Black Death had passed like a terrible storm, leaving behind a landscape so transformed that those who survived could scarcely recognize the world they had known. Between 1347 and 1353, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population had perished. But this is not a story about the plague itself. This is a story about what came after, the strange, forgotten decades when the survivors stumbled through a world emptied of people, when grass grew in market squares, when wolves prowled through abandoned villages, and when everything humanity had built over centuries seemed on the verge of collapse. These are the years nobody remembers, the years between catastrophe and recovery, the years when it seemed the darkness might never end. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Thomas had been 14 when the pestilence arrived at his village in the autumn of 1348. He remembered the fear in his father's eyes when the first person fell ill, old Willem the blacksmith, who had traveled to the market town 3 days prior. Within a week, Willem was dead. Within 2 weeks, half the village lay in hastily dug graves. Within a month, Thomas's parents, his 2 sisters, and his younger brother had all perished, along with nearly everyone else he had ever known. He survived. He never knew why. Neither did the handful of others who lived when so many died. The miller's widow, 2 farmers from the outlying fields, the parish priest who attended the sick until he himself fell ill, yet somehow recovered, and a merchant who had been traveling and returned to find his family gone. Together, these 7 people stood in the empty village square that winter morning in 1349, looking at each other with hollow eyes, wondering what they were supposed to do now. The priest, Father Benedict, was the first to speak. His voice was hoarse, damaged from the illness that had nearly killed him. "We must bury the dead properly," he said. "We owe them that much, but there were too many dead and too few living." The frozen ground resisted their shovels. They worked for weeks, committing the departed to mass graves, speaking prayers over bodies they could no longer identify. Thomas learned then that grief has limits, that the human heart can only hold so much sorrow before it becomes numb, before the tears stop flowing, before the dead become simply a task to be completed rather than individuals to be mourned. When the burials were finally done, the survivors faced a new question. What now? The village, Thomas never recorded its name, perhaps because it ceased to matter, had once held perhaps 300 souls. Now it held 7. The manor house stood empty. The lord and his entire household had perished. The fields that had fed the village lay fallow. The sheep and cattle had wandered away or died from neglect. The chickens had been taken by foxes. The church stood cold and silent except for Father Benedict's lonely masses. "We cannot stay here," the miller's widow said. Her name was Agnes, and she was perhaps 40 years old, though the plague had aged her terribly. "There are not enough of us to work the land, not enough to maintain the mills and the smithy, not enough to defend ourselves if brigands come." "Where would we go?" one of the farmers asked. He was called John, a broad-shouldered man who had lost his wife and 4 children. "Every place is the same, death everywhere, empty everywhere." This was the conversation that echoed across Europe in those years. In thousands of villages, in hundreds of towns, the survivors gathered and asked themselves the same questions. Some chose to stay, clinging to familiar places even as those places decayed around them. Others abandoned their homes and set out in search of somewhere, anywhere, that might offer hope. Thomas's group decided to leave. Father Benedict knew of a monastery 2 days' journey to the east, a large Benedictine house that might have survived with enough monks to continue functioning. "They will take us in," he said. "They will know what to do." So they gathered what they could carry: tools, seeds, a few precious books from the church, blankets, dried food from the stores that remained, and they set out on the road that wound through the forest. Thomas carried nothing but a small pack and the education his father had given him. He could read and write, rare skills in a peasant boy, because his father had been a clerk to the manor lord and had taught Thomas the letters. The journey revealed the full scope of the devastation. Every village they passed stood partially or wholly abandoned. They saw houses with doors hanging open, personal belongings scattered in the streets, unburied corpses in some places where every single person had died, with none left to tend the dead. They saw fields returning to wilderness, orchards unpruned and wild, gardens overgrown with weeds. They also saw other survivors, small groups, sometimes just one or two people, wandering the roads. Some joined them for a day or two before going their separate ways. Others avoided them, fearful that strangers might bring the pestilence back. Trust had become a scarce commodity in the world after the plague. On the third day they reached the monastery. The great stone walls still stood, but when they knocked at the gate, the silence that answered told them everything. Eventually, a single aged monk opened the gate. He looked at them with eyes that had seen too much death. "How many are you?" Father Benedict asked. "4," the monk replied. "We were 83. The monastery, built to house and feed nearly 100 monks, now echoed with emptiness. The dormitories stood vacant. The refectory held tables for dozens, but meals for only a handful. The scriptorium, where monks had copied manuscripts for generations, sat cold and unused. The great library, filled with the accumulated knowledge of centuries, gathered dust. Brother Martin, the elderly monk who had opened the gate, led them through the grounds. He moved slowly, his body worn by age and grief. "We tried to maintain our routine," he said. "The prayers, the work, the study. But there are too few of us. The fields go unplanted. The buildings fall into disrepair. We can barely feed ourselves, let alone maintain this place as it should be maintained." The 3 other surviving monks were equally aged or infirm. The plague had taken the young and strong, leaving only those who had somehow proven resistant or simply fortunate. It had taken the abbot, the prior, the cellarer who managed supplies, the novice master who trained new monks, the infirmarian who tended the sick. It had taken the future of the monastery, the young men who would have carried the tradition forward. Father Benedict looked around the vast empty space and made a decision that would shape Thomas's life. "We will stay," he said. "We will help you maintain this place, and perhaps in time it will live again." So they stayed. The 7 from the village joined the 4 monks in the skeleton of what had once been a thriving religious community. They divided the labor as best they could. The farmers worked the fields that surrounded the monastery, planting what they could manage, though it was a fraction of what the land could produce. Agnes took charge of the kitchen and stores. Father Benedict assisted with the religious offices, his damaged voice joining the thin chorus of aged monks in prayers that echoed through nearly empty halls. And Thomas found himself in the scriptorium. Brother Martin took him there one morning, perhaps a week after they had arrived. The old monk moved among the writing desks, running his fingers along the smooth wood with a sadness that needed no words. "Can you read?" he asked Thomas. "Yes, brother. My father taught me." "Can you write?" "I can, though not beautifully." Brother Martin smiled for the first time since they had met. "Beauty comes with practice. What matters is that you can form the letters, that you can preserve words on parchment. That skill is precious now, boy. More precious than you know." He led Thomas to a desk and showed him the materials, the scraped parchment, the oak gall ink, the carefully cut quills. He demonstrated the proper way to sit, to hold the pen, to form each letter with precision and care. "This work is holy," he said, "not just because we copy sacred texts, though we do. It is holy because it preserves knowledge. It keeps the light of learning alive in dark times." Thomas became a copyist. In the years that followed, he would spend countless hours at that desk, his hand moving across parchment, preserving the words of the past for a future that seemed impossibly distant. He copied scripture and saints' lives as was traditional, but he also began to copy something else, his own observations of the world as it struggled to recover from the catastrophe. The entries were simple at first: weather observations, records of plantings and harvests, notes on who had arrived at the monastery seeking shelter or aid, but gradually they became more detailed, more reflective. Thomas wrote about what he saw in the countryside around them, the slow transformation of a world depopulated. In 1354 he wrote, "The wolves grow bold. We heard them howling near the monastery walls last night. Brother Martin says they never came so close before the pestilence, but now there are fewer people to drive them away, and the forests are full of deer and other game that multiply without hunters to cull them. Nature reclaims what man can no longer hold." The wolves were not the only animals that flourished in humanity's absence. Wild boar roamed through abandoned fields. Deer browsed in overgrown gardens. Birds nested in the rafters of empty houses. The natural world, which had been pushed back by centuries of human expansion, rushed forward to fill the vacuum. But it was not just animals that claimed the empty spaces. In 1355, Thomas noted, "A group of children came to the monastery today. 7 of them, none older than 12, led by a girl who gave her name as Margaret. They come from a village 10 miles north, where the adults all died 2 years past. They have been living wild, scavenging from abandoned houses, fishing and trapping to survive. They speak strangely, having had no proper teaching. They are like feral creatures, but when we gave them bread, they wept." The lost children of the plague years were a phenomenon that haunted the landscape. Orphans who had survived when their parents died, they formed packs, roaming from place to place, half wild and wholly traumatized. Some settlements took them in. Others drove them away, fearful of sharing scarce resources. Many died before reaching adulthood. Those who survived often bore the marks of their abandonment for the rest of their lives. The monastery took in Margaret and her charges. It was what remained of Christian charity in a world where charity had become difficult to afford. The children were put to work. There was always work to do, and gradually, haltingly, they were brought back into the community of humanity. Thomas taught some of them to read, passing forward the gift his father had given him. Margaret proved remarkable. Despite having spent 2 years living like an animal, she retained an intelligence and determination that impressed everyone at the monastery. She learned quickly, worked hard, and seemed driven by a fierce need to prove herself worthy of rescue. Within a year, she could read simple texts. Within 2, she was helping Thomas in the scriptorium, preparing parchment and mixing ink. "Why do you write so much about the world outside?" she asked him one day. She was perhaps 13 by then, thin and wiry, with eyes that had seen too much for her age. "Because someone should remember," Thomas replied. "These years, these terrible years, they will pass eventually. The world will recover. But if no one records what it was like, how will future generations know? How will they understand what was lost and what was preserved?" "Do you think it will get better?" Margaret asked. The question was simple, but it carried the weight of everyone who had survived, wondering if the suffering would ever end. Thomas paused in his writing, considering his answer carefully. "I think it must," he said finally. "It cannot get much worse without the end of everything. And if the end were coming, surely it would have come by now. So yes, I think it will get better. But slowly, very slowly." He was right, though the slowness was greater than he imagined. The recovery from the Black Death would take more than a century, and even then, the world that emerged would be fundamentally different from the one that had existed before. In 1356, Thomas recorded a significant event. "A merchant came today, the first we have seen in 2 years. He travels from town to town with a wagon of goods, salt, iron tools, cloth, spices for those who can afford them. He says trade is beginning again, though it is nothing like it was before. There are not enough people to produce goods, not enough to buy them. Prices for everything have changed wildly. Common laborers now demand wages that would have been unthinkable before the pestilence because there are so few of them. Lords who once commanded hundreds of workers now struggled to find dozens willing to work their lands. This was one of the profound economic changes that followed the plague. The catastrophic loss of population had completely disrupted the labor market. Before 1347, Europe had been densely populated, with more workers than work. Wages were low, conditions were poor, and the common people had little bargaining power. Serfdom, the system that bound peasants to the land and to their lords, had been the dominant social structure. After the plague, everything inverted. With half the population dead, workers were suddenly scarce and valuable. Peasants and laborers could demand higher wages, better conditions, even freedom from serfdom. They could leave their traditional lords and seek better opportunities elsewhere, because everywhere needed workers desperately. The nobility fought back. In England, Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict workers' movement. Similar laws appeared across Europe, but such laws were difficult to enforce in a world where desperate lords would quietly offer better terms to attract workers, even as they publicly supported wage restrictions. The merchant who visited the monastery told Thomas about these tensions. "The world is upside down," he said. "Peasants talk back to nobles. Servants demand coin rather than accepting food and shelter. Some villages have simply declared themselves free, saying their lords are dead and they owe allegiance to no one. The old order is breaking down, and no one knows what will replace it." Thomas recorded these observations carefully. He sensed that he was living through a transformation, though he could not fully grasp its magnitude. The world was being remade in ways both obvious and subtle. In 1357 he wrote about the abandoned villages. "Father Benedict and I traveled to 3 villages this week to see if any souls remained in need of the sacraments. All 3 stood empty, not merely emptied of people, but actively returning to wilderness. Houses had collapsed. Fields were forests of weeds and young trees. The church in one village had its roof caved in, and birds nested in the rafters. In another, someone had tried to continue living. We found evidence of a small garden, some repaired thatch, but whoever it was had apparently given up and left. These places that once held hundreds now hold only ghosts and memories." The phenomenon of village abandonment was widespread. Some villages lost so many people that the survivors simply couldn't maintain them. Others were abandoned for economic reasons. It made more sense to consolidate the remaining population in fewer, more viable settlements than to spread thin across many dying communities. Still others were deliberately cleared by lords who found it more profitable to convert farmland to pasture for sheep, which required far fewer workers than grain cultivation. England lost perhaps 300 villages in the century after the plague. Germany lost thousands. Across Europe, the human geography was being rewritten. The landscape that had been shaped by centuries of dense agricultural settlement was reverting, in many places, to a more wild and empty state. But even as some places emptied, others grew. In 1358, Thomas noted, "A family arrived today and then another, both seeking land to work. They have heard that the monastery has fields lying fallow and will grant tenancies on favorable terms. This is true. We have far more land than we can possibly work ourselves. Brother Martin has been negotiating with them. They will take up residence in the old monastery guest house and work designated portions of our lands in exchange for a share of the harvest. It is not much, but it is a beginning." This pattern repeated across Europe. The survivors were on the move, abandoning places that couldn't sustain viable communities and gravitating toward places that could. Monasteries, with their extensive lands and desperate need for workers, became centers of resettlement. So did certain towns and cities that had maintained enough population and infrastructure to function. The movement of people created new opportunities and new tensions. In 1359, Thomas recorded, "A dispute today between 2 families over land rights. Both claim the same fields, abandoned since the pestilence. Each says their family worked these lands before the death came. Father Benedict must arbitrate, but the old records are lost. The clerk who kept them died, and his house burned in a fire that swept through the village 2 winters past. We have no way to verify either claim. In the end, Father Benedict decided they should work the land together and split the harvest. Neither family was pleased, but both accepted his judgment. The loss of records was another consequence of the catastrophe. Fires had swept through abandoned buildings. Parchment had rotted in neglected storage. The people who held knowledge in their heads, the clerks, the estate managers, the magistrates, had died. Questions of ownership, inheritance, and obligation that would have been easily resolved before the plague now became matters of dispute or simply vanished into uncertainty. In some places, this created opportunity. Enterprising peasants claimed abandoned noble estates. Ambitious townsmen bought up properties from desperate sellers. The social order became more fluid than it had been in centuries. In other places, it created chaos and conflict, as competing claims to land and resources led to violence. Thomas recorded one such instance in 1360. 2 men came to the monastery today, both badly wounded. They had been part of a larger group that attempted to settle an abandoned manor 10 miles south. Another group arrived claiming the same manor. Words became blows. 3 men died in the fighting. These 2 barely escaped. They seek sanctuary here, and we have granted it. But we can hear in the distance the sounds of more violence. The manor burns tonight. We can see the glow against the sky. Law and order, which depended on the complex web of royal justice, noble authority, and communal enforcement, had broken down in many areas. There simply weren't enough officials, enough soldiers, enough judges to maintain the old systems. Brigandage increased. Blood feuds went unpunished. Entire regions slipped into semi-lawlessness. Yet amid the chaos, there were also examples of communities coming together. In 1361, Thomas wrote, "A remarkable thing happened today. Representatives from 7 villages in the region came to the monastery to discuss cooperation. They proposed to share labor at harvest time, to pool resources for defense against bandits, to support a traveling smith who will serve all their communities. They ask Father Benedict to preside over their council and to keep records of their agreements. It is like watching the birth of something new, a voluntary association of free communities, rather than the old system of lordship and vassalage. These voluntary associations were one response to the breakdown of traditional authority. Without lords to organize defense and coordinate labor, communities had to find new ways to cooperate. Some formed leagues or alliances. Others elected their own leaders. In towns, guilds and merchant associations gained power. In the countryside, village communes took on functions that had once belonged to manorial lords. The changes were not always welcome to those who had held power before. In 1362, Thomas recorded, "A knight arrived today with 12 armed men. He claims authority over 3 of the villages in the Mutual Aid Association. He demands they acknowledge his lordship and pay the traditional dues. The villagers have refused, saying his father died in the pestilence, and they owe allegiance to no one. The knight threatens violence. Father Benedict has persuaded him to await a judgment from the bishop, but I fear this will not end peacefully." It didn't. 3 weeks later, Thomas wrote, "The knight and his men attacked one of the villages in the night. They burned several houses and killed 2 men who resisted. The other villagers fled to the forest. The knight has proclaimed his authority restored, but victory may be hollow. The village now stands half empty, and those who fled have gone to seek justice from the king's sheriff. The sheriff, they say, is 3 months' journey away, and may not come at all." The collapse of royal justice was particularly pronounced in rural areas. Kings and their officials were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of disorder following the plague. Courts ceased functioning. Circuit judges stopped writing. Sheriffs found themselves unable to enforce judgments even when they made them. Justice became local and personal, or it did not exist at all. But the towns fared better. Urban centers, despite suffering terrible losses during the plague itself, recovered more quickly than the countryside. In 1363, Thomas accompanied Father Benedict on a journey to the nearest city, a trading center that had once held perhaps 15,000 people. "The city has perhaps half its former population," Thomas wrote, "but it functions. The gates are manned. The markets operate, though with fewer goods and higher prices than I am told prevailed before. The guilds have taken over many functions that belonged to the departed nobility. They maintain order, organize defense, regulate trade. The guildmasters have become, in effect, the city's government. The guild system, which had existed before the plague, expanded dramatically after it. With fewer workers available, craftsmen and merchants could demand better conditions and more autonomy. Guilds became more exclusive and more powerful, controlling access to trades and wielding significant political authority. Master craftsmen who had once been subordinate to noble patrons now operated as independent entrepreneurs. Thomas observed the workshops in the city with fascination. "I watched a goldsmith at work today," he wrote. "He employs 3 apprentices and 2 journeymen. Before the pestilence, Father Benedict tells me, such a workshop would have had perhaps 10 workers. Now there are not enough skilled craftsmen to meet demand. The goldsmith says he could sell twice what he produces if he had the workers to make it. He has raised his apprentices' wages significantly and still struggles to attract them. Many young people prefer to take up abandoned farms rather than endure long apprenticeships. This labor shortage drove innovation. In 1364, Thomas noted, "I saw a remarkable device in the city, a water-powered mill for grinding grain, but larger and more complex than any I have seen before. The miller says it can do the work of 3 traditional mills with fewer than half the workers. He claims such devices will become common now that labor is so dear. I wonder if this is true. If machines can replace workers, what happens to those workers? Though perhaps in a world with too few people, this is not a concern." The late 14th and 15th centuries did indeed see significant technological innovation, driven partly by the need to do more with fewer workers. Watermills became more sophisticated. The printing press would be invented, mining techniques improved, agricultural tools were refined. The post-plague labor shortage created incentives for productivity improvements that might not have emerged otherwise. Yet technology couldn't solve all problems. In 1365, Thomas recorded, "A second wave of pestilence has struck the city. Not as severe as the Great Dying, but terrible nonetheless. Perhaps 1 person in 10 has fallen ill. We have returned to the monastery quickly, praying the contagion does not follow us. I thought the worst was behind us. Perhaps I was wrong." The plague did return, again and again. There were major outbreaks in 1361-62, 1369, 1374-75, 1390 and 1400 among others. None matched the initial catastrophe of 1347-53, but each killed enough people to prevent population recovery and to maintain the psychological trauma of the survivors. The plague became a recurring fact of life, erupting every decade or so, disproportionately killing children who had no immunity from previous exposure. These recurring outbreaks shaped the mentality of the era. In 1366, Thomas wrote, "A young mother came to the monastery today with her infant son. She begged us to baptize the child immediately, though he is healthy and there is no apparent danger. When I asked why she was so urgent, she said, 'Because he might die tomorrow. Everything might end tomorrow. We must do what matters now while we can.'" This is the spirit of our age, a desperate urgency mixed with profound hopelessness. The psychological impact of the plague years was immense. The certainties that had structured medieval life, the stability of social hierarchies, the predictability of seasons and harvests, the comfort of tradition, had all been shattered. People lived with the constant awareness that death might come at any moment, that planning for the future was futile, that nothing could be relied upon. This manifested in various ways. Some turned to extreme religious devotion, seeking to appease a God who seemed angry with humanity. Flagellant movements arose, with groups of penitents whipping themselves bloody in public displays of atonement. Apocalyptic preachers proclaimed that the end times were at hand. In 1367, Thomas recorded, "A preacher came through the region, gathering crowds with his message of doom. He says the pestilence is God's judgment on a sinful world. That worse is yet to come unless humanity repents utterly. He calls for the destruction of wealth, the rejection of worldly pleasure, the abandonment of all but the most basic necessities. Some listen, some mock, most simply seem weary of such talk. We have heard it so many times. Others responded differently. If death could come at any moment, why not enjoy life while it lasted?" In 1368, Thomas noted with some disapproval reports from the city of wild festivals of excessive drinking and feasting, of behavior that would have been scandalous before the pestilence. The young especially seem determined to seize pleasure wherever they can find it. The old morality holds less sway. When I was in the city, I saw unmarried couples living openly together, children born outside wedlock with no shame, debts unpaid and obligations ignored. We might all be dead tomorrow, one young man told me, so why should I deny myself today? The church struggled to maintain its authority in this transformed world. It had suffered devastating losses. Perhaps half of all clergy had died tending to the sick. Many parishes stood vacant for lack of priests. The quality of replacements was often poor, as the church had to ordain men with less education and training than would have been required before. Simony, the buying and selling of church offices increased. Discipline weakened. In 1369, Thomas wrote, "Father Benedict grows frustrated with the new priests who arrive to fill vacant parishes. Many seem more interested in the income than the spiritual duties. One young priest who came last week could barely read Latin and showed no knowledge of theology beyond the most basic catechism, yet he has been ordained and sent out to care for souls. This is what we have come to," Father Benedict said. "The pestilence killed our best and most dedicated, and we replace them with whoever is available." Yet the church also showed resilience. Religious orders that survived, like the Benedictines at Thomas's monastery, worked to maintain standards and traditions. New foundations were established, often funded by plague survivors seeking to commemorate the dead or to secure prayers for their own souls. The mendicant orders, Franciscans and Dominicans, grew in influence, their emphasis on poverty and service resonating with the suffering of the age. By 1370, more than 20 years after the initial outbreak, the world was settling into a new abnormal. The population had stabilized at perhaps half its pre-plague level, though recurring outbreaks prevented significant recovery. The economy had adjusted to the new labor market, with higher wages for workers, but also higher prices for goods and services. Political structures had evolved, with some regions maintaining traditional lordship, while others experimented with new forms of governance. Thomas, now in his mid-30s, had spent his entire adult life in the monastery. He had become the senior scribe, training others in the copying of manuscripts. Margaret, the girl who had arrived half-wild 15 years earlier, was now a capable assistant. Brother Martin had died several years past, but his legacy continued in the scriptorium's ongoing work. "I sometimes wonder what my father would think of the life I have led," Thomas wrote in 1370. "He intended me to be a clerk to some lord, keeping accounts and drafting letters. Instead, I have become a monk, though I have taken no formal vows, preserving knowledge in an age that seems bent on forgetting. Is this a worthy life? I believe it is. The books we copy, the records we keep, these will outlast us. When this dark age finally ends, when humanity recovers its strength, the work we do here will help them remember what was and understand what is." The monastery had become a small center of learning. Boys from the surrounding communities came to be educated. Some stayed to join the religious community. Others returned to their villages with the ability to read and write, spreading literacy in tiny increments. The library, though depleted by losses during the plague years, was slowly being rebuilt through copying and occasional acquisitions. In 1372, Thomas recorded a significant addition. A merchant donated 7 books to our library today, volumes he acquired from a noble family fallen on hard times. Among them is a copy of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy and a collection of Seneca's letters. I have begun reading the Boethius, and I find in it strange comfort. He wrote during the collapse of the Roman Empire, another age when the old world was dying and the new was yet to be born. His words about fortune's wheel, about the transitory nature of earthly things, speak to our condition. Perhaps every age believes itself unique in its suffering. Perhaps every generation endures its own apocalypse. This sense of connection to the past was important. The medieval world had always looked backward, seeing itself as inferior to the glories of ancient Rome and Greece. But after the plague, this backward gaze took on new meaning. The ancients had endured their own catastrophes and survived. Their writings offered not just knowledge but hope, evidence that civilizations could collapse and yet something could rise from the ruins. In 1374, another wave of plague swept through the region. Thomas's entry was brief. It has returned. 3 people dead in the monastery this week. Margaret is ill. I pray for her recovery. Margaret survived, though she was weakened for months afterward. The experience seemed to change her. In 1375, she asked Thomas to teach her more than just the practical skills of the scriptorium. I want to understand the books we copy, she said. Not just form the letters, but comprehend the meaning. If I am to survive in this world, I need knowledge. Thomas was initially hesitant. Educating a woman in theology and philosophy was unusual, even suspect. But these were unusual times, and Thomas had learned that the old rules didn't always apply. He began teaching Margaret Latin in earnest, introducing her to logic and rhetoric, guiding her through the texts that formed the foundation of medieval learning. She proved an exceptional student. Within 2 years, she was reading Augustine and Aquinas, engaging with complex theological arguments, asking questions that challenged even Thomas's understanding. In 1377, he wrote, "Margaret has a mind as sharp as any scholar I have encountered. She sees connections I miss, finds problems in arguments that seem sound to me. If she had been born male or in a different age, she might have studied at a university, become a theologian of renown. Instead, she copies manuscripts in a half-empty monastery in a depopulated countryside. It seems a waste. Yet what else is possible?" What was possible was slowly expanding. The disruptions of the plague years had created small spaces where women could exercise authority and agency in ways previously foreclosed. Widows ran businesses. Women managed estates in the absence of male heirs. Some convents became centers of learning and influence. The strict gender hierarchies of the pre-plague world were bending, if not breaking. In 1378, Thomas recorded news from the city of a woman merchant who has established a successful trading company. She began as a widow, continuing her husband's business, but has expanded far beyond what he achieved. She employs 12 men, owns 2 ships, trades in wool and wine and furs. The guildmasters debate whether to admit her as a member. Some argue women cannot hold such positions. Others note that these are extraordinary times requiring practical solutions. If she can do the work and pay the dues, why not admit her? I suspect she will prevail. The old certainties have too little force to resist such capable people. The case of women's roles highlighted a broader pattern. The plague had disrupted social hierarchies in ways that created opportunities for some, even as it destroyed the lives of many. Social mobility increased. A skilled artisan could rise to become a guild master. A clever peasant could accumulate land and become prosperous. A merchant could build wealth that rivaled the old nobility, but increased mobility didn't mean equality or justice. In 1379, Thomas noted, "A man was hanged today in the village for theft. He had stolen a sheep, driven by hunger. He and his family had fallen on hard times after illness prevented him from working. The village jury showed no mercy. They say theft has increased terribly since the pestilence. That harsh punishment is necessary to maintain order." Perhaps they are right. Yet I cannot help but feel that desperation rather than wickedness drove this man to steal, and that a world with more charity might have saved him. Crime did increase in the plague years, driven by the breakdown of social structures, the desperation of survivors, and the absence of effective law enforcement. Banditry flourished. Theft became common. Violence increased. The responses varied from harsh punishment to vigilante justice to simple resignation that disorder was the new normal. In 1380, Thomas was 46 years old, middle-aged by the standards of the time. He had spent more than 30 years at the monastery, had survived multiple plague outbreaks, had watched the world transform around him. His chronicles had grown to fill dozens of volumes, a detailed record of the forgotten years when Europe struggled to recover from catastrophe. "I wonder who will read these words," he wrote that year. Perhaps no one. Perhaps the work of preservation is its own reward, and it matters not whether future generations know our struggles. Yet I hope someone will read them. I hope someone will know that we endured. That in the darkest years when it seemed the world might never recover, we continued to work, to learn, to hope. We planted crops that we might not live to harvest. We taught children who might die before reaching adulthood. We copied books that might burn in the next fire. We did these things because doing them meant we had not given up. that we believed in a future even when the present offered little reason for belief. The late 14th century saw gradual stabilization. The population remained low, but it stopped declining quite so precipitously. Economic structures adapted to the new reality. Political order, though different from before, began to reassert itself. Trade networks that had collapsed were slowly rebuilt. Towns that had emptied began to fill again. In 1385, Thomas recorded, "A census of sorts has been conducted in the region at the bishop's request. The numbers are grim, but not as grim as they might have been. We count perhaps 3,000 souls in an area that held 8,000 before the pestilence. Many villages remain abandoned, but those that survive seem more stable than they were a decade ago. Families are having children, and those children are surviving to adulthood more often than in the dark years immediately after the Great Dying. It is not recovery, not yet, but it is no longer collapse." The church had also stabilized, though at great cost to its authority and prestige. The Great Schism, which began in 1378 when rival popes were elected in Rome and Avignon, had further damaged the institution's credibility. Common people, already skeptical after watching so many clergy fail to prevent or explain the plague, now witnessed the spectacle of Christianity's leaders hurling excommunications at each other. In 1387, Thomas wrote, "A wandering friar came to the monastery, preaching reform. He says the church has become corrupt, that it serves wealth rather than God, that it needs purification. His words find receptive ears. Many people have lost faith in the institutional church, though they remain Christian. They seek a more direct relationship with God, less mediated by priests and rituals. Father Benedict is troubled by this. He sees it as the first step toward heresy. But I wonder if the friar speaks some truth. The church as it was before the pestilence is gone. What emerges after must be different, perhaps better." These calls for reform would intensify over the next century, eventually contributing to the Protestant Reformation. But even in the 1380s, the seeds of change were visible. Bible translations into vernacular languages began to circulate, allowing common people to read Scripture without clerical mediation. Mystical movements emphasized personal spiritual experience over institutional authority. Critical voices questioned church doctrine and practice. In 1390, another plague outbreak struck. Thomas was too old to help tend the sick as he had in previous outbreaks. He remained in the scriptorium, continuing his work even as he heard the sounds of suffering from the infirmary. "I am become like those ancient monks who copied manuscripts while Rome burned," he wrote. "Perhaps that is all I can do. Preserve what knowledge I can, while the world convulses around me." Margaret, now in her 50s, had become indispensable to the monastery's operations. She managed the library, supervised the education of students, and maintained correspondence with other religious houses. Her gender made her unusual, but her competence made her irreplaceable. When Father Benedict died in 1392, some argued Margaret should be given authority over the scriptorium and school. Others objected that a woman could not hold such office. In the end, a compromise was reached. A monk held the title, but everyone understood Margaret did the actual work. Thomas recorded this arrangement with wry amusement. "We maintain the forms while reality diverges. Thus it has been throughout these years. We pretend the old social order persists while everything has changed. We claim continuity with the past while living in a fundamentally different world. Perhaps this pretense serves a purpose. It allows change to occur without provoking excessive resistance. Or perhaps we are simply cowards, unable to acknowledge how thoroughly the plague has remade our civilization."